Tim's closing the doors and we'll get started. I do want to remind you that daylight saving time ends Saturday night. So set your clock back an hour Saturday evening. Or you may actually end up on time next Sunday. I think that's how it works. James chapter 4, we began in verse 13 as we resume our study of the epistle. I'll read verses 13 through 17 and then we'll look at the text. Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance. All such boasting is evil. So, whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. And James chapter 4 comes to a close. Come now. This expression is found only twice in the New Testament. Both times in the letter of James, here in verse 13, and again in chapter 5, verse 1. It is the equivalent of saying, listen up, pay attention, get this. He's making a point that they need to grasp, and so he's calling them with an imperative to pay careful attention so that they understand what he's about to say. The target or targets of James' reproach here or rebuke are those who boast of accomplishments but never consider that they're not in charge. God is in charge. I want you to keep that uppermost as we go through this text, because he is not saying, as some people conclude, that it is wrong to plan. He's not suggesting that we shouldn't look to the future. What he is saying, and this is really important, is that even though you plan things out carefully, you can't be confident that those plans will be realized, because ultimately you're not in control. God is, and so make your plans with an understanding that God really is in charge. So listen up, specifically you who say today or tomorrow we will go into such and such a town and spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Now, I think I may have mentioned to you last Sunday morning that Abraham's children were noted for their ability to turn a profit. And when new cities were being developed, they were often welcomed because they were industrious, they knew how to make money, they generally set up shop and provided goods at a profit for themselves, but goods that were needed for the local inhabitants. And so it was a win-win. And James knew, and now we know, that this was characteristic of Jewish people. I don't say that with any kind of negativity attached to it. In fact, in some ways, it's, I think, commendable. Where would we be if there were not people in business to provide the things that are necessary for our day-to-day living? what James is getting at is that they approach this with a cavalier attitude. I can do what I want and be successful because of who I am. And James is saying, no, you've got to understand that your best laid plans may not materialize. How many times have you planned something only to realize sometimes at the last moment it's just not going to work out? Something else comes up. In my line of work, that's been characteristic for nearly 50 years now. And my children just got accustomed to my always saying as we plan things, if God wills, because I know, and I think they came to understand, that we're not always in charge. But God is, and if we submit our plans to His will, then we are prepared if those plans are not realized. It's an acknowledgement of His superiority and, in a sense, our inferiority. These folks would map out a whole year in advance and assume that they would be successful. They will locate a town, they will dedicate a year to trade, and they will make a profit. How many people do you suppose have started businesses with that kind of attitude, and today they're shuttered? I can think of one location where restaurant after restaurant has come and gone, and today it's empty again. And I think every one of those folks intended to do well, to make a profit and be a success. But it didn't work out. There aren't any guarantees. Now, sometimes people are very successful. And as I said, the Jews were noted for their industry and their success in this regard. But James is saying, submit to God. After all, we have dealt in this 4th chapter already with the contrast between earthly wisdom and that wisdom which is from above, and the contrast between pride and humility. In essence, someone who makes this kind of boast, today or tomorrow I'm going to this city and set up shop for a year and make a profit. They're being arrogant, proudful. And God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. If you make such a statement as the one that is attributed to those who are the recipients of this letter in this context, you don't even know whether or not you'll be alive, whether there will be a tomorrow. You don't know that you'll be physically able to make a journey to another town. You don't know whether circumstances will allow you to succeed or will lead to your failure. You don't even know if you'll be granted entrance into the city once you arrive. That was not always possible. Sometimes doors were closed, figuratively speaking. And strangers were not permitted to come in and set up shop. And you certainly don't know whether your activity is going to be profitable or unprofitable. How can you speak with such a boast when there are so many variables that are out of your control? That's the point that James is making. And then he says in verse 14, you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? How would you like an assignment this afternoon? Go home, get an 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, and just begin to write what you perceive your life to be all about. And how long do you think you'll live? And how confident are you? Actuaries have figured out about how long the average person's going to live. If you're a certain age now, they will tell you statistically that you'll probably make it to this age. And then they design insurance rates to line their pockets and fleece the insured. No intention there, Bethany, to reflect on you. I just wrote a really wonderful review of your insurance agency this past week. I hope you hear how great you are. But life insurance in particular, they really have a pretty good idea of what they're doing, and they generally don't lose. But once in a while they do, because there are all these variables, and you can't predict or forecast everything. Life is unpredictable. And we think that we're just going to go on and on and on. Death happens to other people, but James is saying, look, you're making all these plans and you don't even know about tomorrow. You don't know that you'll be alive. Do you realize what your life really is? It's a mist, a fog. You know, coming in every morning before 7, driving Route 60 into town along the river, the fog can get really heavy. But there's a section where the 821 heads out of town that is almost always fog-free. It's kind of interesting. And I will come in and turn the security cameras on, and everything's dark, and the fog is, it just makes things almost impossible to see. But within 3 hours, the sky is blue, the sun is bright, and there's no sign that there was even any fog. It comes and goes that quickly. And James says, folks, that's what life is like for all of us. It's but a vapor. It's kind of interesting to look at what the Scriptures say in relationship to life and all of the analogies that are given. So I jotted down for you some of those that you'll encounter if you read the Bible carefully. In Job, the 7th chapter, the 6th verse, the text says, "My days are swifter than a weaver's shuttle and come to an end without hope." That probably doesn't mean a great deal to most of us. How many of you have seen a weaver's shuttle in action? Probably not many, if any. But they move pretty fast. Chapter 8, verse 9. "Because our days on earth are as a shadow." Now that one I think we can all relate to fairly easily. Just a shadow. Psalm 90, verse 9. Moses wrote one psalm, the 90th psalm is attributed to him. It's there that he says, "The days of our years are 70, and by reason of strength they be 80. Yet are they soon cut off, and we fly away." Well, he also said there, we spend our life as a tale that is told. It's a short story that seems to be over before it's really started. It just goes that quickly. In the 103rd Psalm, verse 15 and 16, Isaiah 40:6 through 8, 1 Peter 1:24, "Life is like the grass or the flower of the field." Elsewhere in Scripture, you'll find that life is compared to water that is spilled, to a flying shadow, which flits across the sky and in whose shade the toiler rests briefly, looks up only to find that it's gone. To a frail and fragile flower, to sleep, to a dream, to a handbreadth, the width of a hand, to a shepherd's tent which has been removed, to a tale that's told, to a long journey one is about to undertake. And most of those, I believe, we can identify with. Life at best is brief. Our oldest member here was 111 and a half when she passed. We've had several who passed the century mark. Prior to Mary's passing, our oldest member was 108 and a half. Charlie Clark, when he passed, and had a mind like a steel trap. I will never forget when Brother Hardiman was here for a gospel meeting, and we went down to visit Charlie, and for probably 45 minutes, Charlie recounted the whole history of the Old Testament to Hardiman. And just on and on and on, telling story after story from Scripture. Pretty amazing at that age. But really not a long life. It passed quickly. Life is like that. And that's what James is saying. Folks, don't forget you have a limited time. Use it well. Use it wisely. And never forget who's in charge. A mist, a puff of smoke that appears for a little time and then vanishes. That's what life is like. I grew up at a time when I think just about every man I knew smoked. I was so thankful that smoke didn't hang around forever. Now the smell tended to, but the smoke at least disappeared. Didn't take that long for it to blow away. James says, that's the way your life is. One moment it's there and the next it's gone. What's the implication? That we need to value the moment. Take advantage of what we have now. No, it's not wrong to think about the future, but realize the present is all we have. I often tell people, if you take care of the past by getting your life right with God through obedience to the gospel of His precious Son, your future will then be secure, and you can really enjoy the present. But if you don't prepare for eternity, I don't know how you deal with the day-to-day problems of life that are inevitable. In fact, I will be talking to you about that in the next hour. Life can get pretty tough in a hurry, as all of you know. And it's only a relationship with the Lord that, in my judgment, gets us through the difficulties. And I think you'll see that James is implying that throughout this epistle. Get your life right with the Lord, and then things will fall into place. They won't all be good, but out of them you can be better. And when life has passed, when the smoke is cleared, so to speak, on the other side it will be even better than anything we experienced here. Given the brevity and uncertainty of life, the fact that we're not in control, James offers this instruction. Rather than planning today or tomorrow I will go into such and such a city and buy and sell and make a profit for a year, you ought to say, if the Lord wills. Does that mean that every time we make a plan, we must verbally, audibly express the understanding that if God wills, we will do such and such? There are many people who would say, not at all, that all that is required here is an understanding on your part that this is the case, and then you're free to make your plans, but you know in your heart of hearts that those plans are always subject to God's will. And I wouldn't deny that we ought to know that in our heart. But does he not say that you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that? In my judgment, it is appropriate. In fact, it is not just wise, it is following a biblical mandate to express such things verbally, audibly, to acknowledge that as a child of God, You recognize who is in control, and you surrender your will to His. I can remember when this was done routinely by nearly everyone. Then again, I'm old. I don't hear it much at all anymore. And it may well be that people in their hearts are knowing and acknowledging, God, you're in control. This is what I plan to do, but I realize you're really watching over and directing, and I can't speak with certainty. But isn't it much better just to acknowledge that? That's what James says you ought to say, if the Lord wills. And it's in direct response to those who make the bold statement, today, maybe tomorrow, I'm going to leave and go to this city, and I'm going to set up shop. I'm going to stay there a year, and I'm going to make profit. Well, all of that would have been fine if it had just begun with, if the Lord wills, today or tomorrow, I'm going into such and such a city and set up shop and make a profit. See how important it was to say those few words at the outset? It alters everything. James seems to be implying, is he not, that if you don't state it, it must not be your attitude? Am I saying to you that every single plan needs to be prefaced with, if the Lord wills? If the Lord wills, I'm going to finish my coffee before we're done. I doubt that happens, because I almost never finish it. I'm not talking about frivolous things. I don't believe James is talking about frivolous things. But the matters that truly matter need to be surrendered to the will of God. Let me give you some examples. Psalm 40, verse 8. I delight to do your will, O God. In a sense, that's acknowledging exactly what James is saying here. My life is determined by God's will for my life. And my goal is to do His will. Psalm 143, verse 10. Take me to do your will, for you're my God. Whatever tomorrow holds, I place my life in your hands, your will be done. Jesus, in the course of His ministry, and it's really apparent in the Gospel of John, acknowledges His desire to do the will of the Father. Chapter 6, verse 38. I have come down from heaven, He said, not to do my own will, but the will of Him who sent me. In John 5:30, He said, I seek not my own will, but the will of the Father, which hath sent me. In the garden, as you well know, in Matthew 26, in verse 39, 42, and again in 44, Jesus prayed a specific prayer. Father, if it be your will, take this cup from me, but not my will, your will be done. Understand that this was a statement that needed to be vocalized, an acknowledgement that His goal in life was to do the will of the one who sent Him. Now, of course, in context, He is in the Garden of Gethsemane, about to be betrayed. He's separated from Peter, James, and John. The record says about the distance of a stone's throw. So you kind of figure how far the average man can throw a stone. And I don't know the size of the stone, so it's a hard thing to do, but I believe the intent was not all that far. And He begins to pray earnestly, and He's asked the disciples, Peter, James, and John, to stay awake and pray as well. And He prays, Father, if it be your will, let this cup pass from me. And He returns and finds them asleep. And I think one of the most comforting, from my perspective, statements in this encounter is when Jesus acknowledges of them, the spirit is willing, but the flesh is weak. It was not their intent to disobey him, to not stay awake and not to pray. But there are limits to what we can do physically. Is that not true? I have never been critical of people who fall asleep in an assembly. Because for some people, it's just really hard. It may be that they're exhausted from the previous week. They may be not quite feeling as well as normal. They may be taking medication. There are all kinds of reasons where that might happen. I'd like to think that if the Lord could be understanding, that I could be understanding as well. And somebody might say, well, you put them to sleep, you ought to understand. And I guess that might be true as well. But the point is that there are limits because we're physical beings, and it helps me to know that Jesus understands my limitations. Because there are times when what I want to do and what I'm able to do are not the same. Just as was true there. But I digress. He prayed 3 times, not my will, but your will be done. And that's an example of repetitious prayer. And someone will say, but didn't Jesus prohibit repetition? No, he did not. He prohibited vain repetition. Vain repetition is just saying the same old things because that's what I always say, without putting thought into it, without being really expressive of the true sentiments of the heart. There are some prayers that, in my judgment, we should be praying every day, and sometimes several times a day, because there are matters that weigh heavily on our heart, and they need to be brought before God. And when we're conscientious and sincere, God applauds that kind of repetition. It's when we just mouth the words and are not concerned about what the words really express and whether or not they are the true sentiments of our hearts that it becomes vain. When you look at the ministry of Paul, 1 Corinthians 4:19, he said, but I will come to you shortly if the Lord will. There's that statement. 1 Corinthians 16:7, if the Lord permit, another way of expressing the same sentiment. Acts 18:21, I will return again if God will, this statement to those at Antioch. And those are examples from Scripture of how important it was to acknowledge what James says needs to be acknowledged, the sovereignty of God, the brevity of life, how uncertain things really are, and how important it is to just put our life in the hands of God and acknowledge, not my will, but your will be done. He calls this statement, today or tomorrow I'll go into such and such a city and buy and sell and make a profit. He says that's boastful and arrogant. He says when you fail to acknowledge that it is the Lord's will that must be done, you're boasting and being arrogant, and all such boasting is evil. Boast is from the Greek word kalchomai. And I don't normally mention Greek words, but it just seemed to me that this one you needed to understand. It literally means to be loud-mouthed. Not just in casual statement, well, tomorrow, God willing, see, that's just how I am. It just comes out for me. But tomorrow I'm going into such and such a city and set up shop and buy and sell. And he's not just in casual conversation. The idea is that he's just being very loud and boastful about what he's going to do. It's kind of like the football player that's interviewed before a game and he's telling everybody, oh, I can handle him. He doesn't bother me. I'll be able to keep him in check. They're not going to get past me. And then you watch what happens and you realize that it was just all words. If you are going to boast after the victory and not before the fight. There's a passage in 2 Kings 20, verse 11, that I think is just really insightful. It comes from King Ahab, and normally Ahab, Jezebel's husband, is not noted for his spiritual outlook on life. He's not the kind of person that I would advise you to turn to if you were seeking guidance. But in this particular case, he makes a statement that is right on target. He says it, or has it dispatched to Ben-Hadad, who's the king of Syria, and has attacked Israel and said about Samaria, the capital, by this time tomorrow there won't be a handful of dust to give to each of my soldiers. That's how certain Ben-Hadad was of victory and the complete and utter destruction of Israel. So Ahab says to tell Ben-Hadad, and these are his words, "Let not him that girdeth on his harness boast himself as he that putteth it off." 1 Kings 20, verse 11. The harness here has reference to the armor for battle. And Ahab is saying to Ben-Hadad, do your boasting after you won your victory, not before the fight. And he's simply acknowledging that we don't always know how things will turn out. And it's not just true when it comes to physical blows as nations rise against nations. It's true on every level. The unexpected happens. And we should expect the unexpected. To do otherwise is to be boastful, and that's arrogance. Arrogance comes from a root word meaning to wonder about and reflects empty pretense, so the lexicons say. It was sometimes used to describe charlatans who traveled about from place to place selling phony goods. That's the root. When we think of arrogance, we think of somebody who's full of hot air, who talks a wonderful game but makes a lousy failure at playing it. That's the kind of man who says today or tomorrow I'm going into such and such a city and buy and sell and make a profit. He's boastful and he's arrogant. All boasting is evil and comes from Satan. All such boasting is evil. Has its roots with the devil. Seems to me that that's a pretty plain forward, straightforward paragraph, is it not? If you have not been accustomed to doing it, James would say from this point forward, make plans, but always make them with an acknowledgement that God is in control and these plans will be realized if it is God's will. And again, I'm not talking about frivolous kinds of things. We're talking about the matters that really matter and how important it is to acknowledge the role of God in them. And then chapter 4 closes with this statement. To him that knows to do good and does not do it, to him it's sin. Now, the English Standard Version says, so. So means, given what you've just heard from verse 13 through 16, here's what you need to understand. If you know this and you don't do it, that constitutes sin. If you make plans and don't factor in the will of God, that's sinful. That's the context. But there often is a greater application beyond the immediate context, is there not? Because the principle that has come from this brief exchange here, James with his readers, that making plans is all right when you make them with an acknowledgement of God being in charge. When you don't acknowledge that and make your plans, that constitutes sin. And I think we would all agree that that's the context out of which this statement is found. But on the other hand, we would also be compelled to acknowledge that this principle applies to most of life. When you know what you ought to do and you fail to do it, James says that constitutes sin for you. When we talk about sin, we usually categorize. I can remember growing up, preachers would come for gospel meetings, and when they preached on sin, they would talk about sins of commission. Things you do that you commit that violate the law of God. Transgressions and unrighteousness, to use the language of 1 John 3:4 and 1 John 5:17. And I understood that. That makes perfect sense to me. For instance, thou shalt not commit adultery. If you commit adultery, you're guilty of sin. Commit sin. Sins of commission. Thou shalt not steal. If you steal, you've committed sin. We all understand that. But as a youngster, I never really thought about sins of omission. I just thought you had to avoid the things that God said to avoid, and you're pretty well okay. But James says that there are also sins of omission, when God expects of us something and we fail to provide it. That's verse 17. You're familiar, I think, with the parable of the talents. What did the one-talent man do? He hid his talent. When we were robbed out in Lower Salem, I had a number of things of value under the nightstand in our bedroom. The last place I thought anyone would look. And it was. But I got there and looked, everything was there. But somebody else had put valuable stuff in a cedar chest. And all of that was gone. Hiding things is not necessarily bad, is it? Sometimes it can be a good thing. But in this case, that wasn't true. Let me think about that for a moment. That was a parable about judgment, if you were not aware. And there are actually other parables about judgment during the ministry of Jesus. Guy N. Woods wrote the Gospel Advocate commentary on James, and he made this observation, and I'll just quote him because I can't say it better. Every judgment parable in the New Testament reveals that the punishment meted out was not for something bad that individual did, but for something good he did not do. It is affirmed that the one-talent man was wicked. Matthew 25, verse 26. You go back and read the account. He's called a wicked man, but the man was not an embezzler. He didn't embezzle any of the funds that had been entrusted to him. He didn't squander the money. He didn't waste it on riotous living like the prodigal son. He was not remiss in the trust, in that the talent was returned to its owner in whole. So he wasn't dishonest. There's no indication that he was a drunkard, a thief, a murderer, an immoral character. Yet he was a wicked man. Why? Because of the good he did not do. And I think this is really important to understand. We go through life thinking everything's going to be fine because we can go through the checklist. And I'm not opposed to checklists, by the way. I'm glad that every pilot goes through a very elaborate checklist before they take off. It helps you get, as we would say today, your ducks in a row. I've never needed ducks in a row, but if I ever do, I guess you can get it done if you know what you're doing. But there are lots of other things that if you're going to get it accomplished, you need to be organized and check off all the boxes. But just avoiding the things that God says to avoid isn't enough. You also must do the things that he demands. And that's what James is saying here. The Good Samaritan story in Luke 10 tells of someone who understood this principle and of two who clearly did not. The priest and the Levite both saw the man beaten, robbed, and left along the road in the ditch, destined to die, and did nothing. And the Samaritan, whom the priest and Levite would not have had a good word for, went out of his way to help because it was the right thing to do. He could and he did. And that's still what God expects of us. And he always expects us to do what we can first and use what resources we have before soliciting others to assist as well. There is a tendency to recognize that action needs to be taken and think that the proper response is to call somebody else to do something. That's not what the record says here or anywhere else. And in Galatians chapter 6, as that letter draws to a close, the apostle said, "Be not deceived, don't be fooled. God is not. Whatever you sow, that shall you also reap. He that sows to the flesh shall of the flesh reap corruption. He that sows to the Spirit shall of the Spirit reap life everlasting. As we have therefore opportunity, let us do good unto all men." Us is collective here. Me, you, everyone who acknowledges the name of Christ. We have a responsibility when we know the right thing to do it. And if we don't, that constitutes sin. So Woods makes this observation. A knowledge of what is right creates the obligation to discharge the duty involved in it. Doubt regarding the propriety of an action necessitates abstinence from it. One sins in doing that which is of doubtful propriety, and one sins in knowing an act is obligatory and does not perform it. And he cites, of course, Romans 14:23, and this is the third category of sin, sins of conscience. Whatsoever is not of faith is sin. If you do anything thinking that it's sinful, for you it is sinful, even if it's a matter of indifference to God. If you see something and know that God wants you to do it and you don't do it, that's sin. If God tells you not to do something and you do it, that's sin. Sins of commission, sins of omission, sins of conscience. I think that any sin can be placed under one of those three headings. Let me give you really quickly now, because I heard the bell, an example of a sin of conscience. I have told you before, my mother came from a Christian home. My father did not. In that home, my grandparents believed that playing cards was sinful. Any cards. I was not old enough to ever ask why they believed that, but when they passed, the children didn't share the same conviction. And they loved to play canasta, handed foot, and rook, and dirty hearts, and you name it. Not for money, by the way, just as recreation. For my grandparents to have played would have constituted sin for them, because they would have been doing something that they felt in their heart was not right. Their children, however, recognized that there is no prohibition in Scripture that says you shouldn't play rook or canasta or hand and foot. We had a dear Christian lady who was very upset because some of our ladies met on a regular basis and just played cards together in the afternoon. She asked me, after talking to somebody in the country, what I thought about it. I said, "I think you'd be better off playing cards and stopping gossip." because there's nothing wrong with them getting together and playing cards or dominoes or pick up sticks or jacks if they please. The Bible doesn't say anything about that. It doesn't say anything about going to the movies. If you're my age or a little older, you may remember a time when preachers got in the pulpit and pounded it about going to those sinful movies. Well, some movies are sinful. Don't go to those. And some are fine. Discern and make wise judgments. But always remember, sin comes under three headings: commission, omission, sins of conscience, and we need to be considerate of all. Chapter 4 closes, God willing, chapter 5 next week, and James is going to return to dealing with the rich again. And if you think, well, he's not talking to me next week, we are all rich, folks. Blessed way more than we deserve. I just wish we all understood that. Worship begins in about 15 minutes, so visit and try to stay awake.